Friends, my name's Lori Albright. I'm with the UU Congregation of Cleveland, and so happy to see you here this evening. If you have an opportunity, as we're beginning here, if you could put your name, your congregation, and any comment you'd like to share regarding your thoughts over this past week about theology and widening the circle of care and concern. What we are about to do. Joan, I don't remember if the chalice lighting is before the agenda or after. I'm sorry.
Wherever you want to put it, dear.
Yeah, wherever you want to.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and start with our chalice lighting. And the words I have selected for our chalice lighting this evening come from the Reverend Dr. Hope Johnson, who passed away suddenly recently, great loss to our movement. And she wrote a chapter in this book called Centering, which I highly recommend to you. And so I'm taking a passage from the very last part of the chapter in her book. In case you have it, I'm starting on page 119. And it begins with a passage that she quoted from Margaret Wheatley, who many of us in UU land have heard of. And then she offers a few comments afterwards. So for our chalice lighting, I'm going to start with Margaret Wheatley's comments that Hope Johnson quotes, and then Hope Johnson's reflections on that. So I will begin. In this turbulent time, we crave connection. We long for peace. We want the means to walk through the chaos intact. We cannot find connection, community, and peace by withdrawing from others or going unconscious. The peace we seek is found in experiencing ourselves as a part of something bigger and wiser than our little crazed self. The community we belong to is all of life. The turbulence cannot be controlled, but when we stop struggling and accept it as a part of life, it feels different. And that ends the passage by Margaret Wheatley. And then Hope Johnson writes, Unitarian Universalism can be a stellar leader in our world with aspirations for multicultural community. Though we still have to work real hard at it, the goal is for each member to not only be valued, but also feel at home. The goal is for each of us to be encouraged to have a sense of ownership. Our renewed understanding of inclusion suggests that we no longer need a notion of other. Unitarian Universalism is moving from the language of otherness to the language of inclusion. I want to be part of this. Unitarian Universalism is the unique position of being able to help us all remember our worth and dignity, regardless of how difficult it is. This includes leaders. This includes me. And so our chalice lighting ends. So again, if you can put into the chat your name, your pronouns, where you live in Ohio, your congregational affiliation, if any, and if you need a copy, Samuel posted a PDF of the Widening the Circle report in the chat. And but if you need more information, please post that in the chat as well. So what I'd like to do is to lay out for you what we plan, how to spend our precious time this evening. After I finish speaking here, Linda is going to provide us with an introduction to Mary Byron's Joy in the Spiritual Work. And then Samuel is going to do a piece on centering theology and by Dr. Sophia Betancourt, which was part of our chapter for reading, followed by a few quotes from Dr. Elisa Ortega. Then Reverend Mel Hoover and perhaps a few others may be speaking on liberatory theology and UUism. And then we have significant time for breakout groups. I know last week we all felt like there just wasn't enough time, so there's more time for discussion. And then we're going to have our checkout and closing with the wonderful Reverend Kelly Kelly. So that's our plan for the evening. Our guidelines for being together, we've gone over them last week. I'm sure you'll remember them. We want to risk vulnerability and create courageous sharing. Speaking from our own experience. We want to share airspace. We want to listen deeply to others. Be intentional about the language that I use, and take responsibility for the impact, not just the intention, but the impact of my words. Thank you.
And now, Linda, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Joan. So hi, I'm Linda Hale. I'm from the Akron Church, and I'm taking my beginning thoughts from The Joy in Spiritual Work by Mary Byron. So if you've looked at that on page 8 and 9. And I wanted to read one of the quotes in her chapter, in her small work here, by Arundhati Roy. I hope I said that first name correctly. The trouble is that once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you've seen it, keeping quiet, saying nothing, becomes as political an act as speaking out. There's no innocence. Either way, you're accountable. Just made me think about lots of events that have happened over the last few years, how keeping quiet isn't an option in our faith. If we're going to respect the inherent worth and dignity of all people, you know, this is how we move forward with economic justice, housing, immigration, environmental justice, education, equal opportunity with education, as well as wages. And Mary Byron says, white people built these, and white people are required to dismantle the unjust, inequitable, and cruel systems to completely transform them. I think that requires us getting uncomfortable and talking about this just from my point of view, in a more personal way. I'm willing to acknowledge my role, and I'm willing to accept responsibility for how I've held up the white dominant culture. And in doing so, and bringing that, what I call, to the light, by speaking up, I think we begin to change it. I think it begins to get heard, and we talk about it. I think it's an important issue. And I wanted to tell you a story about how I became joyful and spiritual around racial work. And it happened about 3 or 4 years ago when I was taking names. I was having people sign to get issue 3 on the ballot when it was still not an issue yet, and before it was voted on. And you may remember that in Ohio we lost that, but yet standing on corners or streets wherever I was at, and I would ask people to sign it. And one day a group of people came by. There were like 6 or 8 of them. And so I asked them if they would sign it. And they were all Black or people of color. And so they were like very engaged and was signing it. And so one of the women asked me, why was I doing this? And I told her it made me joyful. And I feel like, I know I'm a UU, but you know, if there's a way to find salvation, if there is such a thing, it's doing this work, at least for me, because it makes me so joyful to do this work and to be here and to be able to say that I have found something I never thought I would find in terms of joyful spirituality. And so I actually would like to see more joyful spirituality spoken outwardly from our pulpits and from each other to each other, because it creates, I think it creates a bond that is just unbreakable bond to love this work that you're willing to find joy in it. So I just encourage you. If you haven't looked at this, you might think I'm a bit crazy. There are those who still do. I just want to encourage you to, if you haven't purchased the book or gotten the information online, which you have the link to now, I encourage you to read this chapter and then go back and look at The Joy in the Spiritual Work by Mary Byron again and see how it fits for you. Or in some cases, how it doesn't fit for you. And if it doesn't fit for you and you're a UU, ask why. And then get curious. That's what I would ask you to do. Get curious if you're not, especially if you're white. It's our responsibility. It's our time to stand up. It's our time to be in front of the line. Thank you for listening. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Linda. Now we're turning to Samuel Prince, and he's going to be talking to us about some of the theological elements in a wonderful essay that's part of that Theology chapter by the Reverend Dr. Sophia Bentoncourt.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joan. I thank you all for being here. Last week, we kind of spoke about the triangulation of theology, mission, covenant, and theology and you. And I think I was a little bit hyper because I love talking about theology. So for some reason, I think my thoughts got But it's great to have you all here. It's great to see your faces. So what we will be discussing today, it's about a conversation about the intersection between race, faith, liberation. Many times when we hear about the word liberation, some things come to your mind, right? I mean, liberatory, liberation. I mean, we hear about the various words in which is usually quoted about the fact that, yes, we have to have a liberated faith. We have to have a liberation theology and so forth. And what does that mean as it intersects with faith and race? Who do we center at the center of the conversations or the discussions in which we're having about race, faith, and liberation? So I'm going to ask Joan if Joan could put up a slide up there. I think something that I have created for us. If we, okay, yeah. So, oops, not that far yet, Joan. Not that far. Not oops, you're going too far. There we go. There we go. Thank you so much, Joan. Two books that I would encourage us to have in your library when we're thinking or we're wanting to talk about liberative theology or liberation theology. And one of the books is Centering. And who do we center? Lori did a great job of having a reading from the centering. So, and also Unitarian Universalists of color, listen to their stories, listen to these rich stories that is coming out for us about our faith. Now, many people would say that the father of liberation theology is someone by the name of James Cone. So I'm going to have Joan fly in that quotation, which is up there. Yeah. So James Cone said, I hope that from the book, I should say, it says, I hope that we will take James Cone liberatory method seriously and begin to re-engage our living traditions with new voices at the center as we move forward. Okay, so it's at that center is where we meet. At that center is where we could hear the stories of liberation. Those who have been freed from many of injustices in which we carry, or I should say, maybe they're feeling freed. And the reason why is that when we have liberatory theology, it's a matter of you and I being on that same page so that we don't have to look at people of color as other. We don't have to look at another person with an eyes of something else. And in this way, we are moving forward. So I'm going to have Joan on the next quote there. And here is what James Cone said. James Cone said, a Black theology is a theology of liberation because it is a theology which arises from an identification with the oppressed Blacks of America, seeking to interpret the gospel of Jesus. And, there's language here, friends. The gospel of Jesus in the light of the Black condition. It believes that the liberation of the Black community is God's liberation. Think of that. Black theology is a theology of liberation because it is a theology which arises from an identification with the oppressed Blacks of America, seeking to interpret the gospel of Jesus in the light of Black condition. It believes that the liberation of the Black community is God's liberation. Many times there is this tug of war that occurs with those from the biblical theology and liberation theology. There's this tug and pull. And the reason why is that, when we put within liberation theology the ways how a certain group of people have been affected, sometimes it creates that tug as far as, is this actually true theology? So what we will do is that we will look at the book. There's some wonderful thoughts in which was quoted in there. When we're speaking about center theology, a conversation about faith, race, and liberation. And what Sophia Badamcourt did is the fact that she took a sermon, a homily from someone by the name of Palamo Calto. And what Palamo Calto said, it is indeed something whereby we all should be a part of. This is what we all should know. So Joan, I will have you bring up that next quote. Yeah. So this is what Palamo said in her sermon. Palamo said that describes us as a whole, a healing and broken people, Also, as a whole, healing and broken faith, and as a whole, healing and broken world. And then she asked this question, and what an important question it is. How do I inherit this broken world with grace? I will let that sit with you for a couple of moments there. How do I inherit this broken world with grace? And to me, this is at the heart of liberation theology, because as we live in this broken world, how is it that you and I could view the broken world in which we live in and then to view it with grace? The things in which we see, the kind of injustices in which we see, how could we still inherit this broken world with grace? The sermon goes on to say that when we center the voices of people of color at the center of what is it that we do, whether it's our bylaws, whether it's our covenant, whether it's whatever projects in which we are working on, if we could center those voices, but centering those voices can be also the fact that some of our congregations may not have a people of color, right? But the fact that as we become aware of this, as we become noteworthy of keeping in mind the voices of injustices, that is another reason, that's another way I should say as to how we could center those voices. Another part of what Paloma had said, and again, I will encourage you, friends, if you have the book, please read over what it says about centering theology. I'm just taking out snippets here. She also said, it is only when we come to bear witness to the cracked and shattered pieces can we begin to help heal what has been broken. Only when we come to bear witness to the cracked and centered pieces can we begin to help heal what has been broken. And friends, there's a lot of cracked pieces in which we all see sometimes, right? We see the injustices again. We see the pieces sometimes is laying right before our eyes. It's shattered, it's cracked. Then how could we help as far as healing? A universalist theology of liberation in this present day, it centers on our capacity to be sanctuaries of radical truth telling, and abundant compassion, so that all embrace and love at the center of our tradition can serve to make all of us more whole. And what does that simply mean? It simply means the fact that once we could hear these stories, once we could hear these voices, at times these gender non-conforming voices, sometimes the voices, which is not of authority, sort of, but we're centering the voices of those who have been impacted. That is when we could have some healing. That is when we could pick up these broken pieces, and therefore, you and I could be at this place whereby we could say, yes, there is a means of healing. So I have a question for you, and this is going to be an open discussion, friends. Okay, I have a question for you. Joan, could you put that up? Yes. So the question that I have for you, friends, is what symbols, messages, principles, or experiences are most central to your deep understanding of Unitarian Universalism? Let me repeat it again. What symbols, messages, principles, or experiences are most central to your deep understanding of Unitarian Universalists? I will start this off in some ways, right? So when I read this question, I have to tell you, the first thing that came up for me was symbols, right? And I thought about the chalice. And I began to say, what about the chalice gives me a liberatory thought? What is it about the chalice that makes me feel as if this is radical? You know, we say we light our chalice, we open up our container so that we could all be within the spiritual space. But what it could be your chalice, but what are the symbols and messages or principles which is most central to your deep understanding of Unitarian Universalism? So you could either raise your hand, I think. I guess we have the screen up, so hopefully we can raise your hand, or you could go to participants. If you go to participants, if you click on participants, and then you will see a raised hand. Maybe you could raise your hand in that way too. So what symbols or messages or principles that you feel is the most central?
And if you want to put it in the chat,
Oh,
you can put it in the chat box. Yeah.
Remember last week we said that we needed some more time to talk, right? All right.
Susan says covenant.
Covenant. Susan Williams. Yes, Susan said covenant. Okay, so I'm going to ask you, Susan, and I don't mean to put you on the spot here at all, but could you enlarge on that some more? What did you mean by when you say that covenant is central to your deep understanding of Unitarian Universalism? You could take yourself off speaker.
I would say that for me, my understanding of covenant is that what makes it sacred is that it's about mutual survival. So for me, that sort of brings the two foundations of the principles into an active living engagement, into relationship. So if I have inherent worth and dignity and you have inherent worth and dignity and we're interconnected, covenant is how we live that out. It's where we get down and dirty. And we, just as the homily you were referring to talked about of things being broken, it's been said that we're covenant making, covenant breaking, covenant remaking people. So it gets broken and then it gets fixed. You try again.
Yeah. I appreciate that. I see the hand of Sandra.
Hello. I want to say what triggers this in me is thinking about the principles. And to me, I would say very central to my understanding of Unitarian Universalism is the first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of all people. And also the seventh principle, the interconnectedness of people and nature. I think that those two things together are what resonates for me most strongly in the principles. And I was in a workshop at General Assembly where they were asking a question about which principles we thought were central, the most central ones. And I was very surprised at the number of people who did not pick those two. So I have been thinking much on that since then and how that relates to
our theological underpinnings for working on anti-racism. So that's what resonates for me in this space.
I appreciate that. The seventh principle, that web, right? That world web of interconnectivity. What else?
Mary Jo had her hand up.
Hi, Mary Jo.
Hi, Samuel.
It's actually Daniel speaking.
Oh,
Sharing the screen. Hi, Samuel.
So actually, because we're shut down in Akron, we have the chalice in our house. And guess what we're doing with it? We are polishing it because it is a really central part of our service and it should like really shine. But there's only one problem with that chalice. It's kind of like not very, it's very shallow. And so what I want to share to you is that Mary Jo and I think that it should be a lot deeper because it should include a lot more people. So.
all right, Dan. Good to see you. Awesome. Yeah, our chalice.
We're shining.
I'm sorry, Dan.
So we're shining it up. It's going to be really bright when you see it next.
In person, huh? Boy, that day may come. No, that day will come.
It will come.
It will come. Thank you so much. Dan Schneider.
Yes, can you hear me?
You can.
Okay. The word I looked at the word experiences. That's how I look at relations to different organizations, religious organizations. And the word for me is acceptance. I have been a member of various religious organizations during my lifetime, but I have never felt the acceptance that I have felt since I attended a UU church more than 14 years ago. And that is something that is important, and it connects to the first principle, certainly. And I think that's something that I want to share with others, whoever they are, and I try to do that as much as I can.
Yeah, appreciate that. April.
I'll talk about experience too, because the first time I even went to West Shore and walked into the sanctuary, and when I saw all the different faith symbols, to me, that was like this immediate message that there is not one way of viewing the mystery we live in. And I found that to be, that felt like home right away to me. I'm in a place that I felt was grounded in something spiritual, even though probably not everybody in that sanctuary would use that word. But I felt it, and I felt the power of not just one path. And I love our universalism tradition of no one's going to hell. That is just, no, it's not happening. I think that is liberatory. And I just thought of it. I'm sorry, I can't remember the sister who brought up the principles, but I think that takes us to the importance of getting the eighth principle and how central that is for our faith and our commitment with what Widening the Circle of Concern is all about. To have the eighth principle, and I don't know what the process is, and I know Linda talked last week about Akron's in the process of working on that, and I would like to see West Shore do that too. But our principles and our sources are key, and the fact that our sources bring in a lot of different sources, and the fact that we need that eighth principle to speak, to tie in the first and the seventh, but to make it absolutely in language clear that there is no way to peace and beloved community without dealing with white supremacy and doing anti-racism work, and that it's central to the inherent worth and dignity of every person. That's our work for as white people. I mean, it's everybody's work, but we as white people, there's a certain kind of work we need to do with that, and and especially talking to other white people, especially. And so I think I've said enough, but that's what comes to my mind.
Thank you. Yeah. I want to go back to what Paloma said also, as she as she was speaking her homily, it it drew me close to what she was saying because of the fact that she was saying, let us center the voices of people who are youths, people who are queer, people who are trans. Center these voices and give them the room that they have so that they could tell their full stories and their lived experiences, because usually most times what center the voices we hear are the white voices, right? We hear the white voices there. We hear the statements are coming from a white voice. But when we begin to center the voices of others who have those lived experiences, we begin to hear through their lens, through their eyes, how is it that they're being impacted and have been impacted. So I will encourage us all as you look at the book Centering, as you look at the book Unitarian Universalists of Color, try to always to be in company, be in relationships with people as to who are impacted, and we will hear those stories. Those stories would come right out to us as we listen and as we begin to look at the ways as to how we could deepen our theology. Any other thoughts in which we may have on that? Any other thoughts or things that come up to you before I move us on to Mel? All right. Thank you all. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing your stories. And now let's move over to Mel. Oh, no, we're going to move over first to Joan. I'm sorry, Joan.
No. I just have a very short little piece here to share with you, because in the chapter on theology, there's a wonderful short little essay by the Dr. Elias Ortega, who talks about the need for us to really think in terms of collective salvation, as opposed to the individualism that has run rampant in Unitarian Universalism for so very, very long. And he says that collective salvation, of course, requires collective sacrifice. And what this means is that you can't have just a small group of UUs who do all the work. It takes us as a collective whole if we're going to move forward. And he says that living into that power of that collective whole, we have to be accountable for repairing the legacy of theological harm that we have, perpetrated against some in our community. He says that we need to strengthen ways for our people to draw nourishment and strength from our faith as we look at it as a collective whole. We have to, of course, draw wisdom from our inherited tradition, he says, which is something that we've been talking about quite a bit. But this drawing of collective wisdom, this drawing of inherited wisdom, is not an individual task, but a collective covenantal practice. And this ties back into the discussion we had about the importance of covenant and bringing that to the forefront of who we are now, especially in this time when there are so many divisions, people of different economic levels and generations and races and ethnicities and abilities and orientations and gender identities and all of this. We have to remember that we're a covenantal faith at heart, that we are a community faith. And if we do so, then we have a better chance of surviving, frankly, the changing attitudes about religion and faith in our country. We have to realize that we are all in this together. So I just wanted to highlight that little bit from Dr. Ortega before moving on to Mel. Okay.
Hello. I am Mel Hoover, as some of you know, and sitting next to me is my homework assignment.
Well, that's an interesting one.
You were supposed to talk to someone about that, am I right? Theology and stuff. So I picked this, it's a little bit of a cheat since we've been talking about theology for 50 years together, but.
So I'm Reverend Rose Eddington, and Mel and I met in seminary way back over 5 decades ago. God.
And part of it is sharing a little bit of just our experience, I think, coming through the time. You know, we seem to think that we're at a point that is kind of new, but in times of culture, but it's just the next spiral of trying to sort things out. Coming through the time when Rose and I were in seminary, coming through the 60s as shaping times, attending seminary, we have a great deal of support and trust in seminaries because that's where we met and that's where we married. And as a Baptist and as an Episcopal person coming in.
I was the Baptist, by the way.
By the way, which many people think is the opposite. They often think it's the other way, assumptions. But I think theology for us is actually important. And it has been. And I think part of it is we've had some journeys in our understanding and how we've come through that process. You want to do a quick thing about just a little bit about Rose? What shaped you theologically to get you to seminary?
To get me to seminary. Actually, it was my congregation growing up, which was American Baptist. It was, I had originally thought that I would get a degree in Christian education because I was going to a small Christian college, and then they decided that should be offered on the graduate level, which was a really good thing because that got me to Rochester, New York, and opened up my mind amazingly. But I really like theology. I really like some theology. I had a lot of trouble with theology in divinity school in some of the courses. But when we got into when liberation theology started coming about, then I felt like theology was really speaking to me. We've talked about James Cone and Black liberation theology. There was also in South America, the liberation theology that was growing in discussions throughout the Roman Catholic Church in South America, looking at issues of class and people who are really poor and oppressed, saying, what does the good news, the gospel of Jesus, have to say to me as a poor person instead of what a more upper class Roman Catholic priest is telling me? So I have my Doctor of Ministry in Feminist Liberation Theology because I really needed to understand and to get a grasp of what was going on in that world. And it really helped me make sense of getting at, I think theology at its heart gets at, who are you? Why do you exist? And realizing that you never exist in a vacuum. It's always relating to someone else. I think, Linda, when you talked about salvation, if there is such a thing, and then Joan talked about salvation too. Well, at its root, salvation is about wholeness. It's about asking, what makes me whole? What makes you whole? What's going to make our society whole? What will heal our planet? I think we get stuck. I got stuck initially because I was rejecting anything that had to do with salvation because it was always associated with a personal relationship to Jesus. And I was struggling so much with that I couldn't understand a larger meaning of salvation for quite a while. And then when I really looked at it, took a course in Christology, saw that it was really about what makes you whole, it changed my whole thinking.
You mean wholeness is important in Unitarian Universalism?
Well, why else would we want beloved community?
And that relates to salvation somehow, that we're trying to save ourselves and save our family and the people we love?
We are, you could say that we are a salvific faith.
oh my gosh, that sounds so contrary. That's what to think about that. But important. Well, it's interesting. My path, it's interesting because I grew up in a beloved community. My family, multiracial, multi-class, all kinds of things. But we were a family. We were the O'Neill clan, and we had Native American, Black, Irish, Jewish, a whole mix of folks. But that never was the issue. We were family. And the important thing about that is all of us saw each other as family and accepted and treated each other as family. And so I was kind of in a protected world in some ways, even in the time of segregation. I had this experience that was not the norm outside the walls of our family, except, interesting enough, in my Episcopal church. Because in times of segregation, we were a Black Episcopal church, because the Episcopal church was segregated during that era. But we were a Black Episcopal church that had white members from multiracial families and other folks who were part of our congregation, St. Philip's in Columbus, Ohio. And it was an interesting congregation because, as most folks, most Black Episcopal churches were at that time, many of them were missions. In other words, they weren't fully able to finance themselves and support themselves, et cetera. Well, our congregation for many years had been, I don't know if you know this term, we were called the brown paper bag church. And anybody know it? Well, basically, colorism within the Black community and the white would be that the people who went there usually had the skin color of a brown paper bag or lighter. So therefore, it was often informally seen by others as racially mixed folks and others who were trying to be like white folks in some perspectives, or others that were more acceptable because we weren't dark African folks, so white Episcopalians didn't have to be so upset. So that's kind of the inside scoop on that. But part of that was we had a congregation. My mom for many years was a superintendent of Sunday schools, and what we were taught is the first thing that our Episcopal church did, they sent out these little pamphlets for the lessons to Sunday schools and adult classes. And the thing that you would do, of course, is they're teaching you about your faith. So our first task when the year began was to get those pamphlets. And in our classrooms, we get a box of crayons and other kind of tools. And we would make the people in those pictures look like the people we understood they were. Because not to do that would mean we were modeling and ingesting to ourselves a lie about the reality of the people of Jesus's time and who Jesus was and what he looked like. And we'd be perpetuating the white supremacist perspective that our faith was, Christian faith was at that time lifting up. And so our way was to say, no, we claim this, we own this. We also decided that Jesus was okay in our church as we grew older, because I take and still take the model of Jesus, the living, active Jesus who was in the world doing things and engaging people, engaging the issues of his time, is a worthy model. I had a problem with Christ because Christ was a creation for the institution to model and to control and to build power over and hierarchy. Well, that wasn't what I was about, and I couldn't be part of containing that. So the irony was, when I was growing up, many people thought I was going to go into ministry, but I could not. I got to the point where my Episcopal theology and structure no longer worked for me, because in the system of the Anglican or Episcopal Church, it was still racist. And therefore, to go into it, I was making a choice to perpetuate that. And then ironically, several things happened in '68. Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were killed. And in my mind, those were two symbols of the folks who could help lead us and show us a way of being in right relationship with one another. We also had just come through a period of the late '60s, if you think about it, in that time, which for the first time, we became a non-legal apartheid country. Well, what is it? Because we've been an legally apartheid country until '64, '65.
Where are you going?
Which the issue being grounding. So white supremacy was the floor and rule within our culture, within our society, within our faith groups, including Unitarian Universalism. And I think we sometimes seem to forget that. We tried to skip over some of that with integration as a model and a vision, integration first, beloved community, another way of talking about it, to say that there's this place, not in heaven, but on earth, where we can be partners together. We can be an honest and authentic relationship with one another. And I think that's part of the time when I was coming in. And ironically, the seminary we were going to, all those elements could come together. The faith groups, the racial thing, the largest collection of Blacks who had ever come to the seminary through the different schools. Five schools joined together, the Rochester Theological Center. And I bring this up because what it gave me and what it gave Rose in some ways is a living community of practice, in which we had to say where we and what shaped us is no longer adequate. It should not be perpetuated. And I was one of the people that closed the seminary down. The Black students actually locked up the seminary based on the fact that what had happened is that when Dr. King was killed, students at that time started a fund to create the first Black church studies.
Well, the Black Caucus.
Okay, thank you. The Black Caucus and a few professors formed a fund to create the first Black church studies chair within a predominantly white seminary to begin to talk about how do we have a theology that works for everyone. We also had introduced, believe it or not, James Cone to the seminary and said that James Cone, we think, is going to be the voice of theology for the future, and he has a chance to be here. In fact, he gave his first series of Black theology and Black religion at Colgate as part of a job interview. And the issue was, we told them this was going to be the future. And they offered him a job. He's coming as a theologian, right? They offered him some kind of job that wasn't going to even be teaching. And so anyway, a moment in time. So we said, this is not yet the place it needs to be if we're going to have a liberatory faith and we're going to build from it. So the lockout was based on the fact that when monies were to create this chair were put forth, that enough people had begun to ask questions about what was happening with money and how it was being accounted for and who was going to be in charge of it. And we had launched the daggone fund. We'd raised $500,000 in about 9 months, to be honest. And our commitment was to raise $1 million. So we were trying to figure out how to do the rest. And we couldn't get reporting on it from the school, and accurate reporting on what was going down to answer some of the people from the pews and folks we knew who were giving us money. And so we were good, dutiful folks, good seminarians. And we just gave timelines and says, well, please let us know so we can talk to people. We did this for several months. But you know, at that time, we weren't ready for a lot of BS anymore. The issue is we had a right to ask for accountability. We weren't getting it. And so we simply said, if you can't be accountable to us, after several honest attempts to have information and conversations with the faculty and administration, then this seminary shouldn't function. It should not go on doing what it's doing. And so at a point in time when we did all the right things, we did all the things, gave people second chances, we said we have to stop business as usual. I will admit at that time, I thought that meant I was probably going home. But a wonderful thing happened where the Spirit can work. When we locked up the seminary, there were 19 of us Black folks at that time, one Mexican American. We did it at a time, we weren't trying to hurt anyone. So we did it on a Sunday morning when people were basically at churches and folks weren't around. So when people came back to the seminary, because it had all the places, the classrooms, the cafeteria, a lot of the things were this huge one Gothic structure. So anyway, we locked it up. The media had already picked on it, something that had happened. So what's going on here at Colgate Rochester, which is a major player in the institution and the community? And all of a sudden, the news media is flooding up. People from our congregations have gotten the word, and people from our congregations are flowing in, knowing that some of us were there. The huge crowds of people gathered. And our president at that time, the Reverend Gene Bartlett, wonderful human being, was asked by the press, because he knocked on the door and tried to get in. And he says, and we wouldn't let him in. And they turned around and said, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And I'll never forget the moment when Gene turned to them and said, we are going to take the time to find out what our peers have been trying to tell us that we didn't choose to hear. And in that moment, we then set up an off-campus experience for the next 3 weeks. involving community members, people from our congregations, people from the seminary, cross-cuts of folks, and we envisioned what a seminary should look like for the future, literally. And then we came back. And I'm saying this because, so part of it is, it became transformative. Not only for the seminary, we reshaped seminary education in many other seminaries around the country. It changed how ministry was going to be done. It changed how we needed to be accountable to one another. And I say those are those lessons because at the same time as when Unitarian Universalism seemed to be inviting people in during those years to say, become part of us. And Bach Bawa happened, that we thought we were going to integrate and we broke down. We didn't follow through. We didn't have the courage. We didn't have the understanding. We didn't have the belief that we could really make it happen. These were within the same time frames. So anyway, I'm not going to keep talking, but
I think it shows that our liberations are tied
together.
Because of what the Black Caucus did in changing the school. When I started there, it was the fall after the lockout. I was one of 9 women students. We ended up forming a women's caucus and were able to make changes building on what the Black Caucus had started. So, and it also ended up, as Mel said, it changed the school. It was transformative. It liberated everybody, whether they wanted to be liberated or not. They had to deal with what had happened. And it changed the school. It is still a different school now. And I think that's what can happen with Unitarian Universalism when we really embrace the beloved community. We realize that all of our liberations are tied together. Well, I guess the word now is liberatory. We're liberatory, so there's room for the liberations.
And that was part of the basis of framing ourselves in terms of the journey towards wholeness and the work we were trying to do. We lifted up the concept that said that Unitarian Universalists can be committed to anti-racist, anti-oppressive multiculturalism. And I say that, I want to lift that up. That was very intentionally lifted up because I believe that the women and others in our faith had changed the culture of Unitarian Universalism. We weren't the same folks after the Women's Federation. Other women said, enough of this white male stuff. This is our faith too. And we're not going to behave. We're not going to cooperate. We're not going to let you run the same game that you've been doing on us. We're part of this faith and we're going to shape it. So we have experience in our midst of doing that. In terms of sexual orientation, we said it didn't happen overnight, but as we reached a point, we said, we can't discriminate on gender and sexuality any longer. Neither of those are appropriate. And we had a minority of folks who says, we stand our ground, you have to take us seriously. You have to understand and respect us and let our worth and dignity be lived and realized. So that's anti-oppression. The issue was, how do we take those understandings and make them multicultural, which means we got to have other folks who have different cultures and different races on board. And how do we make it anti-racist? Because you can have racist multiculturalism, you can have racist oppression, anti-oppression. So we are, as a faith, I think that's where we are. We're at that kind of point where we've done some things and we understand oppression. We've been successful in modifying and changing, and we're developing the theologies and stuff to try and make those ways to teach and guide and shape our future. So the issue for me now is, will Unitarian Universalism become an anti-racist faith? Or we maintain ourselves as a trying to be faith?
All right. Well, thank you, Mel. Thank you, Rose, for sharing your story. Okay, go ahead.
Sentence at the end when Mel asks that question, and also going back to Sam's question about what symbolizes our understanding deeply of Unitarian Universalism. For me, it's our congregations,
right?
Our living, breathing congregations. And I think that theology and imagination are very much connected. So for me, I like to imagine that all of our UU congregations are building blocks of institutionalized love so that we can actually use our love ethic that comes from the universalism part of our faith and truthfully go out into the world and really work for beloved community.
And I would say that's the second bite of the apple. Those were the premises around the journey towards wholeness, which we did not take forth in our congregations and in the world.
Sometimes you got to do things again and again.
But you got to learn. We have another chance. Thank you.
And what a lovely metaphor. Thank you guys. Oh my gosh. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us on all of this. Now we're going to do some discussion, my friends. Okay. I have put some questions into the chat box, and we're going to split into little groups of 3 and 4, and then talk about these for a good long time. And you get to decide. You get to decide which questions you want to work with in your group. So it's not like you have to cover all of the groups or all of the questions all at once, but take the ones that mean the most to you. And then you've got 20 minutes now to really dig into some of this and try to digest with your colleagues here, your friends here, some of these thoughts that you've heard about theology. All right, I'm going to create the rooms now.
And also, there is still not enough time, Joan.
No doubt, absolutely no doubt that it's not enough time.
Well, we've had decades and it hasn't been enough time. So
I was going to say.
Thanks, Mel.
Very true. 400 and some odd years. And well, anyway. Well, Kelly, I am now turning it over to you.
All righty. You know, just from my my experience and my group, it has been deeply meaningful to do this work. And even just to talk about the little places that we have found joy and we have found success and sustenance to continue on. We only have, based on my clock, 4 minutes to go. So I don't think that we're going to be able to share some of that deep learning and deep discussion that we had during our breakout groups. What I wonder is if you can put in the chat 1 or 2 words that, I'm trying to think of how I want to word this. I don't want to know how you feel. I don't want to know what you think. What I do want to know is 1 or 2 words on how you are going to make Unitarian Universalism a liberatory faith. And so that might be, you might actually want to put more because, you know, you're typing. And so let's just take a moment to think about that, put it in, and we'll read some of them. So what are you going to do to make Unitarian Universalism truly a liberatory faith? So we have beloved community. live a life of love with deep love, commitment, and devotion, learning and teaching, taking some of this back to your congregation, meet people where they are and be honest and direct from a place of love. We don't have to be nice. We can be honest, direct, and kind. Keep talking about theology. Be both brave and kind. In our group, we talked a little bit about building our muscles, our souls. And it means doing these conversations even when we're scared and we think that we're going to make mistakes. And our stomach is like this. Because the more of these conversations that we have, the more that we widen the circle and talk about the hard things, we'll get better at it and we'll learn. Last but not least, we have centering the 8th principle and folding in the other 7. I'm going to say that we can remind each other that we can have theology without an old white dude with a beard. We can recreate what theology is and make it our own. I know that Joan is going to have logistical things to tell us, so this won't completely be our closing. But I'm going to end for us with words that are from Reverend Dr. Sophia Bentecourt from Service of the Living Tradition in 2018. And this is the passage that is quoted at the beginning of the Theology chapter. We are on a journey toward redemption. We have lived a year filled with lamentation, with the strength of generations, the failures of the everyday, and the deep down gritty messiness that is the promise of our salvation. There is inherent goodness that exists between and among us. I want to honor the weary, ragged miracle that is our living tradition. And in her spirit, I want to remind us all that we are part of that living tradition. And we still have much to write. Joan?
Thank you, Lori, or Kelly. Thank you, Kelly. And I want to thank Lori, and I want to thank Linda and Samuel and Rose and Mel. Absolutely wonderful to hear from you. And I want to thank all of you for being here. This has been recorded. Saturday morning, I will be sending a link out so that you can have your own version of the recording. And we will also be sending out the little slides that we have put together so that you have those as well. So thank you and have an absolutely wonderful evening and weekend. Take care.